Good morning. Welcome to our webinar. I'm Stahl of SecureTheVillage, and this is the March webinar, Information Security Management. And today we'll be talking about cybersecurity without boiling the ocean with my friend and colleague, Barry Weber. We'll hear from Barry in just a couple of minutes. First, I just want to give you a couple of words about who we are, what we're about, and all. We are SecureTheVillage. We are a community-based response to the cybercrime and privacy challenge. With a vision of a cybersecure global village, we turn people and organizations into cyber guardians, from the boardroom all the way to the living room. We got to get everybody involved in this. We also want to acknowledge with tremendous gratitude, Miller Kaplan, the company I work with, for being our platinum sponsor. We're truly coming to you through their good graces. The Information Security Management webinar meets the second Thursday of every month from 10 to 11, just like we are doing now. And the objective is to provide real practical, real-world guidance to information security managers, risk compliance officers, executives, that kind of that body of personnel, of people that live up in the space of having to manage and having to lead cybersecurity, and then others as well: cyber attorneys, IT managers, cyber risk managers, insurance people, law enforcement, and so on. Our speaker, as I mentioned a moment ago, is Barry Weber. Barry's with Assured SPC. He's got a tremendous background. It just covers a number of different technologies and across multiple industries, not just security, but also IT and those areas. I'm a member of several organizations. He's part of the Village Square here on SecureTheVillage, and Barry's a lifelong learner. And as you see with the Block M, Barry and I share the fact that we both bleed blue. We're University of Michigan alums and very proud of it. Barry, let me turn it over to you. Introduce yourself, let's get started. And turn your
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yep.
I thought I had it on.
There you go.
Thanks.
Good to see you, sir.
Thank you, Stan. Yes. And I'm so happy to be here. This topic is one that is near and dear to my heart. Mostly because I've come at security and privacy. I am a partner in Assured SPC, where we focus on security and compliance related privacy issues, where I'm the virtual CISO and privacy practice leader. But the challenge I think that pretty much everybody has is, what does it all mean from the business standpoint, from the practitioner standpoint, from the consumer standpoint? And I believe that I've been able to leverage a multifaceted background in running IT organizations. I did the calculation just this morning, as a matter of fact, that said I have been involved in leading organizations and consulting to industries that were the victims of 64% of the data breaches in the DBIR for 2020. And my IT background includes being a CIO for a number of different industries, starting with a leadership role as VP of IT at BarnesandNoble.com during the internet bubble, and having multiple roles across the industry, including leading functional testing, strategic consulting to financial services and others, and performance modeling for Mercury Interactive, and I come at security this way because it is, in my mind, a combination of satisfying business needs, business objectives, dealing with the IT issues, dealing with security issues and privacy issues, and having a multifaceted view, I think, gives me a different perspective, which I'm hoping to share today.
No, that's fabulous. We are very much looking forward to this. I mean, just one of the things that, from the time you and I met a couple of years ago, and you may want to start screen sharing as well, but from the time, in fact, I think I have to stop so you can start. But let me just, as you're getting that set up, you and I met a couple of years ago, and from that time, I've always been very, very just impressed with both the breadth of your experience, but also then the wisdom, if you will, that you bring to this topic. I think it's a very, very, very valuable, the perspective that you have, as you and I've talked about everything from what we're about to talk about today, but to issues of reasonable security and zero trust models and so on. ISO 27001, another area that you and I have collaborated on. That experience, that perspective, I've always found very, very valuable. So looking forward to talking with you about it, because the ocean's an awfully big place, Barry.
Yeah, it is a big place. And let me start by talking about the key discussion topics of this presentation. As you just said, it starts with, it seems like we have to boil the ocean. And we'll talk about what that means and why. There's another key topic, which is it's really about managing risk. And I'll go into that in some detail. One of the more important facets for every organization is that it starts from where you are today. And every day is the beginning of the beginning again. And it's a journey of planned steps. So we'll talk about each of these in this presentation. And I'm looking for a good dialogue, and I love the discussion questions that you always bring to the table, Stan, and I think that it's helpful for conveying these topics. But let's talk about boiling the ocean for a minute. I know this is a complicated slide that you're seeing in front of you, but it's actually has some fairly simple concepts to it. We're being attacked from lots of different kinds of threats. This is not trying to enumerate all of them. And they're coming from multiple directions. They're coming from the wild. They're coming from insider attacks. They're coming from vendor connections, trusted vendor connections, from customers, and from insiders. So there's a lot of different ways that are coming at us. And there's only a couple things that we can do at a high level to address this. One is that we can put inside a framework. As you see here, the CSS framework surrounding all of this from NIST, and that includes implementing safeguards, implementing practices and procedures to deal with this. But there's so much coming at us all the time, there seems to be a feeling that we have to boil the ocean to reach perfection with respect to security.
So that raises the question whether or not perfection should be the standard. And I ask that in part, one of my favorite Vince Lombardi quotes is that we'll never achieve perfection, but if we strive for excellence, occasionally we may reach perfection.
Yeah, I think the challenge of striving for excellence is that even that's a great agenda, right? We have to strive for excellence. But the challenge from a business perspective is we have to keep it in balance. Let me talk a little more just about boiling the ocean here. And this is an example of, well, what are our choices here? And the answer is there are multiple choices. There's just the frameworks that everybody sees in front of them on a daily basis, including the CIS Top 20, NIST TAB, and NIST 853, this is Release 5, and High Trust as examples. And the number of controls that are available to us that are prescribed at high levels in some cases and low levels in other cases are large. And even the smaller number of them, 172 controls associated with the CIS Top 20, if you implement the third level implementation group, the third implementation group, is completely onerous for many organizations. And you go to the other extreme where high trust would maybe somewhere between 350 and 1,700 controls based upon what you're trying to manage to get certified against. It's ridiculous to try to do this with most organizations, and in fact becomes unreasonable. So the question is, yes, we need to strive for excellence, but we also need to do it in a way that makes sense from the business standpoint and for the others that we need to protect all at the same time. So it blends into even the privacy area, our customers. All of this has to be part of the big question of how far do we go to try to achieve excellence.
Yeah. And that's so right. I mean, when I look at that slide, you just see the numbers there. They become overwhelming. And that so often that results in, well, I can't do it all, therefore I'll do nothing. And that can't be the right answer either.
Exactly. It can't be the right answer. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I think it's sort of natural that every organization or even individuals, when we're faced with trying to accomplish the impossible, you have a couple of choices. You can try to do some of it, or you can decide to do nothing. And doing nothing is absolutely not acceptable. So the question is, where's the appropriate point to aim for every organization, and how do you improve upon that?
Yeah.
One of the critical topics that I began with earlier is about managing risk. And managing risk is about a scale. It goes to this question of reasonableness. Because what we're trying to do with managing risk is to manage the burden to the organization against what we need to do to prevent harm to the organization and to prevent harm to customers and others. And what you see here are just some of the kinds of things that we need to think about on each side of the scale. So with respect to security and what controls we put in place and what practices and procedures that we put in place, we've got to deal with preventing identity theft, reputation issues to the organization, fines from regulatory groups, interruption. Security is about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So business interruption is a major issue that everybody has to deal with. And that's on one side of the scale, which if you add it all up, and sometimes you can do this in a quantitative manner, and sometimes you have to do it in a qualitative manner, it can be incredibly onerous in terms of what we're trying to protect to reach this excellence that you brought up. On the other side of the scale, we've got the burden to the organization. And the burden includes what does it take to implement from a cost, from a people standpoint, to implement physical controls, administrative controls, including process management, as well as things such as security awareness training, many administrative controls, and technical controls, which we tend to focus on a lot in the security space. I think to a bit of an extreme, because these other controls are just as important. And one of the things you and I have talked about, Stan, is a presumption that security is really an IT problem. It's not just an IT problem. And that's pretty important in terms of answering this question.
Yeah. And no, that I find that absolutely vital thing. We find as when we go out into our client organizations, I'm not putting on my Miller Kaplan hat, not the SecureTheVillage hat, but it's the same. I think we go out and we find that IT is not managing security, and yet oftentimes management believes that IT is managing security, and that disconnect can be extremely costly.
Not only is it extremely costly, and you're right that IT may not be managing security and can't manage it all by themselves. But as I said from the beginning, I come at this question from many different perspectives, including roles as IT leadership. And I can tell you that in my personal learning experience, I have found that as I shifted more and more to simply a focus on security, I realized I didn't have the right perspective in just IT, because the thought processes around IT are, let me deliver business value through improving services to our customers through application development. Let me deal with integrity and confidentiality and availability on the infrastructure and operations side, but the concepts of, well, let me think about risk. Let me think about organizational risk, not part of the IT concept, because as it shows in the slide, you can look at, well, what about business constraints as a burden to what the organization has to do? What we find in Assured SPC is, even in the privacy space, the discussion is really about, well, why do we have to worry about this at all? And the answer is there's also a balancing act in the business with respect to how do we capture data about individuals, for instance. And it's a standard marketing view. Well, we need as much as we can possibly get. We need to hold on to it as long as we can possibly hold on to it, because it might be useful someday. And it's costly to recapture all this information. Totally valid business perspective. But the flip side of it is the burden could be, well, if you look at CPRA, for instance, it says you have to start worrying about retention. You have to have a valid reason to hold on to this, because you have a responsibility to protect others as part of security. So there are business process constraints that can also flow into this question of burden, not the kind of things that IT thinks about. Security is a different perspective, and IT has its own valid perspectives about security. So it's really important, and they may not be doing the job. Some of it's because, we'll go to the next slide, it's about, well, how do you make decisions with respect to safeguards? And some of it is about the approaches that you use to manage security are actually not IT questions at all.
Yeah. I know that in fact, just on that point, we have been working with a client of ours just recently, helping them with their business processes around paying vendors. And it's not an IT question. It's a flow between the people who are working with the vendor, who get the invoice from the vendor, and then the accounting department that has to pay the invoice. And the only role that IT has there is that they're the conduit, because these invoices will flow through emails and the network. But the business process is not IT at all in that case.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not only, we find the same thing, it's not only about vendors, it's about the supporting partners that you have that help manage the processes of the business. And you're right, the flow of the data. And at the same time, not only do you have to worry about that flow of the data, you also have to worry about, you've got a network connection with these organizations, which means that they're a potential threat vector as well. If there's all this gets mixed in together to the problem, and IT is not the whole solution. You have to look at it from a holistic business risk perspective in order to focus on this. And the natural thing to do in this standard approach is focus on what you're trying to protect and what are the threats to what you're trying to protect, and how do those threats come at what you're trying to protect. And this is what risk management's about. One thing that's also important in this question of risk management, going back to the perspective of what is reasonable, is a question of, well, how much do you have to do? And how do you decide when is enough is enough? Because it could be too much of a burden. It's not acceptable to say, yes, I've got so much burden associated with protecting data that I have to go out of business. That's not acceptable. So this question of how do I reach perfection is one that is problematic in that respect, because if you try to reach perfection, it may mean you can't exist. But that's absurd, of course. But it's part of the dialogue that's not really discussed a lot.
Yeah, no, and you remind me of a situation a couple of years ago. I got a call from a company, got our name. They were looking to do business with a new customer. The customer had security requirements that this company would have to meet. And I don't know, probably spent a half hour on the phone with them talking about, what it was going to take to meet those security requirements versus how much business this new customer of theirs was going to bring on. And at the end of the day, the company I was talking to decided to walk away from the business because to meet the security requirements that were being required was too much of a burden on them, was too costly. So you look at the return on investment, so to speak, it wasn't there. Clearly, we can't do that across the entire economy. The singular decision, here or there is one thing. And I think that, I don't know if you want to go back and talk about the right side of this chart as well, the likely harm to the organization, customers, suppliers, and others, because I see with CCPA, the new Privacy Act that's about to come into law in California, what Virginia is doing, the New York State requirement for financial services and all, the harm is increasing. That is the harm to an organization. When you're subject to statutory damages of $100 to $750 per person, if people in your database have been breached, have had their information compromised, that makes the harm side of this much higher, tilts that scale down, which says now you have to be prepared to put more on investment on the left-hand side of the screen as well. And I know you and I have talked about the Sedona report on reasonableness, which plays into exactly the same thing. It becomes this chart, I think in some ways becomes the kind of an integral way through which a business's leaders have to look at this question of what part of the ocean are we going to boil?
Yeah. One quick response and then one broader response to this question of reasonable. You were talking about the New York Department of Financial Services putting new requirements on the insurance industry, which looks to be, it's likely and is happening that insurance premiums are in some cases doubling this year because of what's going on, which means that this risk transfer cost is increasing dramatically, which also shifts the question of, well, how much should I be buying and how much should I be self-protecting by implementing appropriate safeguards?
Yeah.
The question that is a very important question is, if this side right here, the burden is increasing dramatically or is out of control in any event, there is actually an answer in risk management and, as you brought up, the Sedona Conference Working Group 11 final report on how to deal with a test for reasonable security. And it relates to a cost-benefit analysis. We're familiar in the security industry by saying, okay, there is also something called risk tolerance. And risk tolerance can be viewed in this particular type of diagram as if this side of the scale is heavier than this, then the organization, if in a pure security perspective thinks about it, is that I can choose to transfer some of that, I can choose to mitigate some of it, I can choose to accept some of it when this side of the scale is heavier than this side. So there's this difference of the angle here. Mm-hmm. That actually gets more complicated when you start talking about privacy, because there's a question of, well, okay, you have to be, the laws say, CCPA says, you have to have reasonable security practices and procedures. And what is reasonable? And that's why I'm so excited about this Sedona Working Group report that came out with a test, a recommended test for is it reasonable that can be dealt with in the courts and any other adjudicators, such as the OCR, for instance, that may be picking up something like this associated with the changes in HIPAA security rule that occurred right at the end of the year. That definition of what is a reasonable test says that the harm to to those that you need to protect outside the organization has to be balanced with the burden to the organization. But then you go to the question of, let's look at the extreme. The extreme is, what about, as an example, an attack against critical infrastructure? You know, the Florida example of an attack against water treatment. Well, the burden could be lives. And what is the value of a life? Does that mean that all these 80% of the companies that manage water treatment across the country have to go out of business? Well, that's absurd. That burden is too heavy. And the cost-benefit analysis, the reasonable test in the Sedona report says, in that cost-benefit analysis, you can define a relative scale of what's reasonable. Meaning to say, something that is extreme over here has to be balanced against a burden that is extreme. But a burden that is extreme does not necessarily have to reach the point of you have to go out of business. So taking a qualitative approach at dealing with this question of what is reasonable in a reasonable test becomes really important. And it also provides the avenue for businesses to say, no, there's too many controls. I don't have to implement all of these safeguards because that would be unreasonable in terms of the relative balance of the burden to the organization and protection of others.
Yeah.
Which goes to the point of saying just adopting the CIS Top 20 is not necessary, not acceptable, good guidance on how to approach the problem, but doesn't answer the question of reasonable. The same thing's true in this CSF and 800-53. There has to be a reasonable test on the controls that are being implemented. And that serves up for us the opportunity to start saying, okay, that's good. Now I say there may be 1,700 controls in high trust and 1,189 controls associated with 800-53. I don't have to do all these things. I can go attack the problem as you suggest by trying to achieve excellence, but there's a way to decide how much is too far and how to get there. And like the next slide talks more about this. Mm-hmm. Actually, it talks about the fact that there's an organizational issue here. We were talking earlier about implementation is what a lot of organizations think about, and IT sits right here at the bottom of this in terms of implementation of technical controls. But in reality, risk management crosses the organization. Here's the middle tier where marketing may have to decide from a process perspective, there is a balance of risk that needs to occur. Here is senior management that needs to think about what is risk that's acceptable to the organization as a whole, and how am I dealing with the regulatory issues, not just the purely technical issues. There is a dialogue for risk management that needs to happen across the organization as well.
Yeah, I want to stop here. Just the last thing you said, I think needs to be amplified. There is a dialogue. All too often our businesses, and this is true across the board, this is not just in security, but our businesses tend to be very siloed. They're broken up into HR does this, finance does this, operations does this, marketing does this, and too rarely does one look at the flows across and between those individual silos. A lot of the emphasis that I've seen over the course of my career in what's called business process reengineering and areas like that, that they require that you take a holistic view of the organization and look across those levels. It's another illustration of it takes a village. It's that same concept in its own way. And this chart, I think, just goes directly to that. It says, look, we can't optimize if we're going to break things down into their silos. Yeah, we've got to go across the silos this way.
Yeah, it's not only a question, you're right, it's not only a question of it has to be a team attacking this problem, but it also implies that you can't just delegate to IT I love what Bob Zukas is doing with the Digital Directors Network and saying this is a board of directors issue, and this is a senior management issue, and it's about helping them understand what does this mean from a business context? What does this mean from a regulatory context? What does it mean from an overall process issue? How does it affect the business? That initiative is really important in terms of dealing with not only as a team, but there's also the vertical role responsibility as well.
Yeah. Let me ask, particularly, I'm thinking, given the breadth of your background, both in large companies and smaller. I mean, I've got aerospace experience and small business experience. I don't have much in that middle where you are. But what I've seen over the course of my career is still a real disconnect between the executives and the technology, if you will, the IT, the security, those pieces that play into the technology. And I wonder to what extent we're in some ways living in two different paradigms, and it's crossing those paradigms that is really our challenge. You mentioned Zukas with his Digital Directors Network being a part of that. I like to think that we're a part of that, of breaking down those silos. But I'm curious, as again, your experience is different than mine. Yeah, how you see that same challenge.
I see it. I like to think of my experience as decades of learning how to do things wrong and learning from it. My experience is that you don't really learn what it's about without having lived in someone else's shoes. Yeah. And it's helpful if you follow my path to a certain extent by trying to live in multiple roles, because you see the world from multiple perspectives simultaneously. But ultimately, it comes down to the therapy session of, do I understand where you're coming from? Can I communicate to you, the board of directors, the senior executives, the VP of marketing, and customer support and operations and IT, in the language and what is on their minds and what's motivating them, and breaking down those barriers and building trust is fundamental to solving the security problem. Yeah. Building trust and opening communication.
Yeah, that's so true. You remind me, years ago, as I was just beginning to find my way into the business world, I listened to a series of audio tapes, if you remember, little cassette tapes back in the old days, by a man named Zig Ziglar, who was the world's greatest salesman kind of title he had. And one of the things I learned from him that I still try to implement today is, you can get anything in the world you want, he said, if you give enough other people what it is that they want. And when we're in security, what do we want? We want to secure the enterprises as best we can, what's reasonable. How we do that is by, giving to the executives, giving to the vice president of marketing, the head of operations, and so on, finding the things we could give them, that now we can enable them to be able to do things that otherwise they could not do. Security, with its idea of, locking the doors, no, you can't get here, that sort of thing, tends to make that hard, tends to make that the challenge in some ways.
Yeah, unrealistic and not appropriate. I think of it in a very similar fashion to Zig Ziglar, in thinking that it's about the best approach to dealing with cross-functional dialogue and trust is to understand what they need and what they want, and trying to help them solve their problem while you solve your problem. Mm-hmm. My problem is, I've got to solve this thing. But at the same time, if I'm having to deal with a marketing organization, well, then let me find a way to help you optimize it from the IT perspective. Let me help you optimize where you store your data. I will find a way to help you be more efficient in your job, but if I can help reduce data at the same time as I help you make it more efficient, everybody's winning.
Yeah.
So that is the only way to try to break this stuff down, and it's difficult. It's difficult because it's tough to walk in everybody else's shoes, but we've got to start from trust. We've got to start from solving each other's problems. And the more you can help somebody solve their problems, more likely, especially if you can figure out how to solve both your problem and theirs at the same time, it's a win.
Yeah. And I think that goes as well to making sure that security is not viewed as the Department of No. One of our early clients, goes back almost 20 years probably. We were working for the head of IT in an organization. Actually, the man actually reported to the head of IT, to the CIO, but he was in charge of security. And whatever people wanted to do, his answer was no, we can't do that. And needless to say, he was not very successul.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm certain that his longevity was about 2 years, or unless he had some significant information that he shouldn't have known.
Right. In fact, we outlasted him. We ended up working for his boss, the CIO, after he left the organization. Because that doesn't work. Business is about getting things done, not standing up.
Business is about getting things done in an effective way as possible, and it's ultimately about optimization and business process reengineering and trying to figure out how to solve common problems.
Yeah, so true.
So the bottom line of all of this is that risk management is the foundation of security frameworks. It's particularly important and allowable to say the journey starts from where you are. I mean, where you are is where you are. You cannot achieve perfection in one day. You can't achieve it in period, but you can't achieve it rapidly. If you're really far away from perfection, you don't have to assume that you're going to be far away. You don't have to. You have to start where you are. It is particularly important to start from understanding, well, what is it that I'm trying to protect? And that is a growing problem. What we're finding, for instance, is that it used to be that most organizations thought that what they're trying to protect is in structured data. It's in my CRM. It's in my database associated with my ERP. It's in some SQL database or some Oracle database or some Informix or Unify or whatever it used to be out there. It's in some database, and that's what I have to protect. And in reality, what's going on now, because of the explosion of unstructured data, is that it is going everywhere. And there are fairly few constraints placed on individuals inside of organizations, which tends to increase the flow of data from the origins and structure to email, to Dropbox, to Box, to SharePoint, to Google Drive, to OneDrive. It goes on, and you end up with multiple copies all over the place. And so the problem protecting it becomes exponentially difficult every single day. And what we find is that one of the ways to solve that is to say, look, we need to help you. There's an IT question here of how do we help you ensure that you've got the tools you need to help run the business. And let's try to minimize those while we help you become efficient. And at the same time, let's put in safeguards then around those tools. But the first step you have to deal with is, where is it? And in reality, every time many clients, we walk in the door, especially in a privacy implementation, say, do you have any idea where you got personal information? The answer is absolutely. We've got it in these 10 application systems, these 10 environments. We've got it in these 100 because we're replicating it on purpose for performance reasons across these or this 1,000. And the reality is we find over and over again, no, it's not true. It's like 5 times more than you think. And we start walking through the data mapping and the flow of data and what you actually do with it and what individuals do with it. And the number of data sources that contain this just grows exponentially to about 5 times what they think where it is. And you have to know what it is from an application perspective, from a physical perspective, from a data perspective, what you're trying to protect. And then you can start protecting it. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we do is we're now using tools to scan the environment because people don't know. You start going through, for instance, manual data mapping. Okay, so you've got this data there. Do you know what kind of data you have there? What kind of classifications? Is it sensitive data, not sensitive data? You start getting to unstructured data, people have no clue, especially because the people that moved it there don't even understand the definition of what is the difference between personal information, sensitive personal information, and so forth. Yeah. So using automation to scan for this makes it fast and efficient, and that's part of the answer to this question of security and privacy. It's about you can't do a lot of this manually any longer. It makes sense to use tools that give you an automated way to not only find it one time, but continuously know where it's going next so you can manage it and protect it. The next bullet is security can and must improve over time, a major assumption that is really important. You don't have to achieve perfection today, but you do have to get to there. You have to have a plan to get there in steps. Mm-hmm. And we talked about reasonable security. I personally love this concept of a test for reasonable security because it sets limits on how much you have to do. And that can be broken down and measured for organizations once you understand what is it I have and what is it I'm trying to protect. Mm-hmm. This last bullet is particularly important, especially in the area you brought up in the subject earlier. We see this all the time with respect to our clients' customers. We see this in the healthcare space all the time, where insurance companies, for instance, will say, you have to implement the following controls. You have to implement high trust. You have to implement the following. I'm going to send you 600 questions associated with a security questionnaire, and it's likely you cannot say, yes, I'm doing every one of these 600 items on this list of the questionnaire you sent me. The answer is not only can you say, no, I can't work with that customer, there's actually a middle tier. You can say, guess what? Here's where I am today. Mm-hmm. And this is what I am doing to prove that I'm making it better. And what we find is that, especially in these discussions of compliance, not only compliance with third parties, our customers, but also compliance with regulatory organizations, we can say, this is where we are, this is what we're doing to make it better. I can show you proof that we're doing this, and good behavior is a valid defense.
Yeah. I find that point so very important in this whole framework that we're talking about. I spent some time yesterday writing an email to a client. We're helping with the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC, Department of Defense regulations, where now initially the important thing is you must do what's NIST 800-171, all those controls. And so our client got an email, are you compliant with, and they named the DFARS associated with that. And the answer is, no, we have not done everything in 800-171. Here's what we've done. Here's our, we have a gap. We know what's missing. We have a plan to close that gap. And I find that first, realistically, it's the only thing you can do. To your point, Vince Lombardi's point, we're never going to be perfect. We can just chase it. That's the best we can do. But also, and looping back now to the HIPAA side, new HIPAA regulations is that what you've just described, that good behavior, is to be taken into account. If you do something, if there's a breach and you've got good behavior, you're chasing perfection, then the fines that HHS will impose on you are to take that into account, as opposed to those fines if you're not doing anything. We're seeing that linkage right now.
Yeah, it's actually always been there. It's always been there. Also, we find with customers that are large, imposing compliance requirements on organizations, but having it codified is certainly helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So the next slide, I didn't want to leave this discussion without saying, well, how do you actually do it? And the answer is, well, there's actually going to be a unique path for every organization, but there is an approach that every organization can take, and it's fundamentally based upon the security maturity of that particular organization. And in this particular slide, there are actually two paths, they're sort of extremes. The extreme at the top here is in a very immature organization. It is what it is, and that's a path. And this one says, well, it's actually a fairly mature organization. There's a reasonable amount or a large amount of administrative controls and technical controls and practices and procedures already in place. So, most often, every organization is somewhere in the middle between these two. But the concept behind them for that organization could be some kind of blend of those two. So this one says, well, let's face it, there's a whole lot of work you have to do just to get your head above the waterline. Not necessarily swimming yet, but above the waterline. And it's appropriate to start with, let me start with one of the smaller groups of controls, CSF or ISO 27000, or the CIS Top 20, maybe implementation group 1, and say, I'm starting right here. And then you say, it has to start with a risk assessment. Everything always has to start with a risk assessment, because that's an important question of how do I measure where I am? It's also important on a continuous basis, not only for the organization, but as we discussed a few minutes ago, it's important to be able to show that you're doing that to third parties, because that's what tells them you are actually thinking through this and making regular progress against the goal of improving. So it starts with do a risk assessment, build a risk treatment plan, define, for instance, on this level, which one of the CIS Top 20 or CSF controls you're going to implement first. Then once you've done that, you define a next risk assessment and a treatment plan, and you move on to the next step. Minimally, most regulatory kinds of things say you have to do this on an annual basis or when something significant has changed. Ideally, if you're at a fairly low level, it would be done more frequently than that, at least quarterly, to show that there's progress and gives the organization some time for continuous improvement. That's one approach. From a more mature perspective, if you've got appropriate safeguards in place and practices and procedures in place and something of a framework for continuous improvement in place, then you can start looking at this more along the lines of, let me worry about the new threats that we're seeing and revalidate in the risk assessment, how am I doing to protect the assets that I'm trying to protect against this new view of what threats exist and coming forward on a regular basis. You take the same stepwise approach. You start from where you are. You know what you need to protect. You do a risk assessment and a risk treatment plan associated with that, and then you define the next point in time. It should be part of your policies, what that timing is. Security policy should define that, and then you execute on that, and you do a next risk assessment, and you continue through this stepwise approach to improvement. This approach is not only appropriate for the business, it's appropriate to answer the question, what is reasonable? And it's the only way to solve the problem for how to move toward perfection without boiling the ocean.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's such a valid point, because what we've often said to clients, and I'm sure you've done exactly the same thing, there's all of this to do. So let's schedule it out. We know we've got to do X, whatever X might be. Maybe it's a penetration test, just to make up an example. Well, that's fine. Let's schedule that for next fiscal year, because this fiscal year we're busy doing all these other things, ultimately to get ready for that penetration test that we know we want to do next year. Now along comes a regulator or a customer wanting to know where we're at. Have you done a penetration test? No, we haven't. But here's our schedule. Here's our roadmap. Here's when we plan to do it. And oh, look at all the things we have done and are doing in the meantime as we prepare for that. Now, if that customer says, no, we need a penetration test right away, okay, we can move things around if you absolutely need it. But again, it's the reasonableness discussion all over again, that same way.
Yeah, it's a moving target, and the biggest solution is coming up with a plan. You have to start with a plan. You have to start with a stepwise approach. And then the question of how you prioritize this should actually come out of the risk assessment. If in fact there's a likelihood that you've got a large web presence, then yeah, I would say you might need to prioritize doing a penetration test early, even if it's just an external penetration test. But and certainly vulnerability testing is the first step of a penetration test. But you need to start there. In organizations that don't have a large internet presence, which means that the threats are not likely coming from that direction, then that might not make sense. The risk is not high associated with protecting the assets that you need to protect and call for a penetration test. It is all about starting where you are, knowing what you're trying to protect, and managing this through risk assessments, and risk assessments are always about prioritization as well. The one thing that this chart doesn't say, which is particularly important, I didn't want to make it too busy, is that it starts with the cadence. The cadence of what you're doing is a governance question. Yes, there are these individual steps, but managing that the program is on track for improvement is a governance activity. This is one of the things I do in my spare time, which I love, is I referee soccer. It's a unique kind of thing. I find it I look at it as another intellectual experience where I am managing a system that is designed to be out of control when I'm a referee. And what's amazing about refereeing is that it's a playground for learning how to manage systems, in my mind. What's unique about it is that as a referee, you actually start the system running. You stop the system at the appropriate amount of time, somewhere between 50 minutes and 90 minutes, depending upon what ages or people are playing. And you've got this test bed of management. But what is significant is that the referee is the governance over the system. That is the role of the referee. And what's important is that the role of the referee is to minimize governance, allow the system to operate, but within the constraints of it's got to be safe, it's got to be fair, and then depending upon who's playing, it's got to be fun for kids. And professional referees focus on for the enjoyment of the audience. Believe it or not, that's one of their governing requirements. But what's important is that you try so hard to minimize impacting the process through governance, but it has to be there because systems won't operate by themselves. They will need correction. And that's the role of governance, including governance over security programs, governance over privacy programs.
Yeah, that's so true. I watch hockey regularly, and watching the referees, the linesmen, it's exactly that same thing. And what you say about course corrections, if you will, calling it that. I remember reading once years ago that Apollo 11, I think it was the first Apollo to land on the moon, may have been a different one, but whatever. It was out of, it was in the wrong, angled in the wrong direction, like 90% of the time. It was continuous periodic course corrections that brought it back on course. And then it goes off. I mean, you're approximating a curve with a sequence of straight lines, basically. If you look at it just purely geometrically that way, that's absolutely the role of governance, and it's so vital. That's why I mean we'd like to get with our clients work with the larger ones on a monthly basis. With smaller ones, sometimes it only happens quarterly. But get in there once that cycle and assess how you're doing, decide what you're going to do, plan it, do it, assess it again, keep that cadence going. Just it's forever as we boil the ocean a teaspoon at a time, so to speak.
Yeah. I think this is the last substantive slide here, but I do want to cover what was it that we were talking about today. Revisit these things. It does seem like we have to boil the ocean, but guess what? We can't. So you have to come up with a different plan. It's important to deal with this on a risk management basis, and we talked about that extensively. Starting from where you are, accepting where you are is one of the more important things to accept, and that is a continuous process. Accept where you are at the next iteration, and then move on, because things change. The world around us is changing all the time. And cybersecurity is a journey of managed steps.
So true. So true. Throw up your last slide a little bit about, you got references, that's right.
Yeah, this is, if you're looking for more information about these thought processes, I spoke about the Digital Directors Network. I believe that a lot of what we need to address is knowledge and appropriate communication up through the organizations, including up to the board of directors. I think, as I said earlier, that Bob Zukas and the Digital Directors organization is doing a great job, and there were some seminars that were done with you in SecureTheVillage, and this is a link to those seminars, webinars right here. Secondly, this is particularly interesting if you have to start low at the end of the totem pole in terms of where are you today. The Center for Information Security, CIS, has put out a mapping comparison of NIST CSF versus the CIS Top 20. They're due to implement a new 8.0 version of CIS Top 20. It's coming out this year, so that's important to watch for. Mm-hmm. And there's an article here that I've written on what is reasonable security and what is the test for reasonable that is really, really important to help organizations manage this question of how much do I need to do, how much is enough, and how do I do that in such a way that assuming that the courts take on the Sedona Conference Working Group 11 final report, and they do, it's been going on for 40 years what they do, then having an answer to this question, what's enough and how do you measure that? What's the test is particularly important.
Yeah, I'm just answering a question on the slides, dealing with a bit. The references, there are others on reasonableness, other references on the SecureTheVillage website. I don't know if we put the Sedona report on there yet. If not, it will be. We'll put that on. At the same time, we'll put this video and these slides as well will be on the SecureTheVillage website. I know, Barry, you're one of our cyber leaders. Assured SPC is a cyber partner with SecureTheVillage as well. So your information and all there is there.
Appreciate that. And I think this is where we are. Services that we provide, basically compliance-oriented services to help organizations deal with this regional approach to security and privacy. We also offer a managed privacy service. I think outsourcing business processes is a good thing to do, and we think of the privacy operations as a business process activity that we're happy to talk with anybody who wants to talk more about any of these things. And there's our URL at the bottom.
Right. And there's your contact information. I'm going to take the screen back just to finish, the kind of round out the webinar, if you will. These are the various programs we have, which you're now looking at. This particular, the management webinar, is the second one down. But as you can see, we've got 2, 4, 6, 7 different categories of events, 6 of which are on a monthly basis. Please join us in all of them. I call out specifically the Workforce Working Group. If you're playing in the workforce area, please come join us there. We're truly working to make a difference in that space. So there's such an opportunity for good jobs, good careers for people who now are maybe out of the workforce. And at the same time, there's a couple of 100,000 open positions right now in cybersecurity. So that's a particular one to pay attention to. If you're a senior person in security, join either the Security and Privacy Leadership Team or the Monday Security Leadership Happy Hour, either of those, and the others as well, if they fit your interests. Beyond that, use our resources, please. You sign up, it's easy, just to get a free Cybersecurity News of the Week and Weekend Patch Report in your inbox every Sunday afternoon. That's free, but follow us, attend our events, learn from our library, connect on the Village Square, and coming soon is a SecureTheVillage app, Android and iOS, for residents. How do you keep yourself, your family secure? Starting with Rule 1, freeze your credit, which is totally different than everything we've talked about. But if you're a family, that's vital. Can't finish without talking about my book, having nothing to do with information security, but a different kind of security, The Agnostic Patriot, A Citizen Searches for the Soul of America. It's not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's not pro this, it's not anti that, it's what's above the battle. How do we get above the battle? As Lincoln said, we are not enemies, but friends. How do we become friends? That's the book that's available on Amazon. Barry's contact information, again, I trust it's exactly the same as what you had on your slide, and my contact information as well. Barry, any final words before we shut down?
I don't think so. No, I think this has been a lot of fun, Stan. I love chatting with you about these topics because I know it's intellectually stimulating. I hope the audience found the same, but I don't have any final comments beyond that.
Well, I just want to thank you again. It's always a pleasure. This lifelong learning kind of thing that you and I have, and I think the fact that, we in some sense share just the fact that we both went to the University of Michigan means there's an intersection of paradigms that way, that same way of kind of looking at the world. Always a pleasure. We'll have you back both on, I think, this one and also the technology and security management happy hour that we have. You're a wealth of knowledge, and I'm grateful for you taking the time to join us on the webinar. So thank you again.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, and with that, we are adjourned. Thank you all.